Just yesterday, we saw a document that was signed by 200 scholars and economists world over, calling for debtors, Sri Lanka's multilateral as well as bilateral debtors, to share the burden of Sri Lanka's debt in terms of restructuring, with assurances of additional financing to the island nation as the country grapples with an economic crisis and awaits IMF's bailout package of $2.9 billion US. I've invited to our studios to join us live now Indian origin development economist who's based in the United States, professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Alhaz Jayati Ghosh. A very warm welcome to you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yes, so you would share the sentiment that Sri Lanka should be given adequate debt relief sans austerity measures. What does this really mean, Professor? We know we're talking to the IMF, the Sri Lankan authorities are engaging with the International Monetary Fund for $2.9 billion US, but what's well known is that this comes with certain regulations and measures calling for the government to implement spending cuts. But when you say no austerity, what alternative do you propose?
Well, the problem is really this, is that the IMF is imposing measures or suggesting measures for a very, very small amount of money, less than 3 billion, when we know that the Sri Lankan total foreign debt is more than 50 billion, that its requirements for imports every year are in the range of about 10 billion. So this is a very small amount that will spread over 4 years or 3 years. Instead, in fact, we really have to think of what policies the countries that rule the IMF do when they are themselves in crisis. Whether it's the United States or the European Union or Japan, when they face crisis, they increase public spending. They don't decrease it. They run larger deficits. And they don't aim for fiscal balance in a period of downswing. The Sri Lankan economy has collapsed by 10% last year. 4.5% decline this year is an underestimate. If the IMF package is adopted, it will be an even larger decline, with much greater devastation, much greater suffering. What we have argued in our letter, the 182 economists who have signed this letter, is that, in fact, the Sri Lankan debt trap cannot be resolved without significant reduction of debt. And that means a reduction by all the creditors, bilateral, multilateral, and private creditors. At the moment, there is no major discussion of the reduction of private creditor debt at all. Bondholders are, in fact, planning to sue Sri Lanka to get the full value of their debt back. And yet, in fact, many of them, all the creditors really, are complicit in a strategy that involved, shall we say, not just corrupt governments taking on debt, but enabling a significant illicit financial flows over the last decade in particular, and encouraging the country to take on more debt to finance what was an unsustainable trajectory. So we are saying that those who were involved in a strategy that has turned out to be so disastrous must also bear some of the costs of that strategy, must also be willing to take a haircut.
Are you also suggesting some sort of debt forgiveness for Sri Lanka here? I'm just trying to make it clear.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And this is, by the way, this is not something crazy or novel. This happens in all credit systems globally. Periodically, there are what are called debt restructurings for private credit debtors, for sure, within countries and externally. There have been many, many cases of debt restructuring. It's really quite common in most debt systems. When there's sovereign debt, we find that suddenly it becomes a big moral issue. It happens all the time with private debtors. We really have to enable this to happen with sovereign debt, especially when we know that a lot of it is effectively odious debt, that the people of Sri Lanka did not necessarily benefit from it, but also because it's clearly unsustainable. Sri Lanka cannot hope to repay this debt in full and achieve any kind of reasonable growth or basic living standards for its people in the near future.
But again, what's the implication of an IMF bailout package? Yes, this is the 17th occasion that Sri Lanka will work with the IMF for a bailout package. We're not new to this, but given the current crisis, what implications do you see?
I think that it's very concerning. As I mentioned, it's a very small amount. And what we already know of the likely conditions is extremely disturbing. They are asking for a fiscal surplus within a few years, which is, in fact, even by 2024, and a very large fiscal surplus by 2025. They are asking for better targeting and more efficient social subsidies and transfers, which really means a reduction in the availability of public services and a rise in price of basic things like electricity and fuel, which will cause all other prices to increase. They are asking for very strict limits on the government's ability to finance budget deficits using the central bank, which again is something that the US and European Union would never contemplate. They would always allow their own central banks to expand lending to the government whenever they require it. So these are very concerning, and you would have to undertake all of these conditions, which would actually make your growth much worse, make your possibilities of growth much worse, cause the economy to decline further, cause unemployment to increase, cause food poverty to increase for a very small amount, for 2.9 billion spread over a very long 4-year period.
Professor Ghosh, I'd like to also ask you this. Now, if debt cancellation offers Sri Lanka the only path to recovery, let's just put that aside. Sri Lankan authorities are forced to work with the IMF now, given this situation. Sri Lanka postponed, delayed going to the IMF, but now there are ongoing deliberations and discussions. Sri Lanka is looking for assurances from debtors, creditors, to give assurances in terms of restructuring Sri Lanka's debt. But at the same time, how do you forecast Sri Lanka's recovery, Sri Lanka's path to recovery with an IMF-supported program, regardless of the challenges you speak of?
It really depends hugely on the conditions. If the conditions are those which are being suggested in the media, then they will not help Sri Lanka recover. They will actually make matters worse. So really, those negotiating with the IMF need to emphasize that they cannot be asked to generate a fiscal surplus within a few years. They cannot be asked to rationalize what they're providing in terms of basic subsidies that ensure minimum goods and services. They have to be allowed to increase social spending. In other words, the kinds of conditions that the rich countries ensure for themselves, Sri Lanka must be willing to fight for those. Because the people of Sri Lanka have just undergone a very major upheaval. They have gone for protests that were admired the world over, peaceful protests that undid a government that was causing great harm to the country. But that should not go in vain. They should not then be subjugated once again by an economic strategy that does not help them.
Right, Professor Ghosh, I look forward to an in-depth discussion with you tomorrow at Hyde Park. But until then, thank you very much for your time here at Studio 24 live on Derana English.